Eastern Front, winter 1944. A German soldier huddles in a frozen trench outside Stalingrad, exhausted from months of brutal combat. Suddenly, papers begin falling from the sky like snow. He catches one, a leaflet printed in German. On one side is a photograph of warm food and comfortable beds. On the other, a simple message: Safe Conduct Pass. The soldier who carries this leaflet will be treated as a prisoner of war under the Geneva Convention. Surrender now and live. The soldier looks around. His comrades are also reading leaflets. Some laugh, crumpling the paper and tossing it away. Others slip them quietly into pockets, saying nothing. A few stare at the words for long moments, perhaps considering the impossible choice: continue fighting for a cause that seems increasingly hopeless, or surrender and survive. These pieces of paper, just ink on cheap stock, might be the most powerful weapons on the battlefield that day. This is propaganda warfare. Between 1939 and 1945, the Allies dropped more than 6 billion leaflets over German-occupied territories and the German homeland itself. 6 billion messages falling from the sky, each one designed to undermine German soldiers' will to fight. The Nazi regime called it paper terror and made possession of Allied leaflets a crime punishable by death. Yet German soldiers collected them, hid them, read them in secret, and sometimes made decisions that changed the course of the war because of words printed on paper. Welcome to Cipher Tales. Today, we decode one of World War II's most massive and sophisticated propaganda operations: the leaflet campaigns that dropped billions of psychological warfare messages on Hitler's armies. This is the story of how words became weapons, how paper undermined steel, and how the Allies fought a war for German soldiers' minds that was just as critical as the battles fought with tanks and aircraft. This is the story of propaganda wars, where the deadliest ammunition was printed in black and white and delivered from the sky. The strategy: why leaflets mattered. To understand why the Allies invested enormous resources in leaflet propaganda, we must first understand the strategic thinking behind psychological warfare. Allied commanders recognized early in World War II that defeating German military capacity required not just destroying German will to fight, but also breaking German will to fight. Traditional military strategy focused on destroying enemy forces, killing soldiers, destroying equipment, capturing territory. But psychological warfare pursued a different objective: convince enemy soldiers that fighting was futile, that surrender was better than death, that the cause they fought for wasn't worth dying for. A demoralized soldier who stopped fighting was as valuable as a dead one, but achieved at far lower cost. Leaflets were the mass medium of psychological warfare. Unlike radio broadcasts that required enemy soldiers to have radios and time to listen, or loudspeaker messages that had limited range, leaflets could be delivered anywhere Allied aircraft flew. They could be dropped over frontline trenches, behind enemy lines, in German cities, across occupied territories, anywhere the Allies wanted to spread propaganda messages. The scale was extraordinary. British and American forces eventually operated massive leaflet production and distribution operations. Printing facilities in Britain, North Africa, and Italy ran continuously, producing millions of leaflets daily. Special aircraft squadrons were dedicated entirely to leaflet missions. Intelligence agencies employed hundreds of writers, translators, and designers creating propaganda content. The Allied leaflet campaign became one of World War II's largest sustained operations. But why invest so much in what skeptics dismissed as mere paper? Allied psychological warfare experts pointed to several strategic advantages. First, leaflets were cost-effective. Producing and distributing a leaflet cost pennies, while killing an enemy soldier through conventional combat cost thousands of dollars in ammunition, equipment, and resources. If leaflets convinced even a small percentage of enemy soldiers to surrender or stop fighting effectively, the cost-benefit ratio was favorable. Second, leaflets reached enemy soldiers when they were most vulnerable, during lulls in combat, while waiting in trenches, during rest periods behind lines. These were moments when soldiers had time to think, worry, and question their circumstances. Leaflets exploited these psychological vulnerabilities, planting doubts that would grow over time. Third, leaflets couldn't be completely suppressed by enemy authorities. German officers tried to collect and destroy Allied leaflets, but with millions falling from the sky, enforcement was impossible. Soldiers inevitably found and read them, spreading the propaganda messages through word of mouth even when physical leaflets were confiscated. Fourth, leaflets provided safe conduct passes that gave German soldiers a rationalization for surrender. Captured German soldiers frequently cited Allied leaflets as influencing their decision to surrender. The leaflets didn't just demoralize, they provided practical tools that facilitated surrender by assuring soldiers they'd be treated humanely as prisoners of war.
The psychological warfare strategy recognized that morale was as important as material in determining military effectiveness. A well-equipped army with broken morale would fight poorly or not at all. Conversely, maintaining high morale could enable forces to fight effectively despite material disadvantages. Leaflets targeted German morale systematically, attempting to create cumulative psychological damage that would reduce Wehrmacht combat effectiveness. Critics within military establishments sometimes questioned leaflet operations. Traditionalists argued that resources spent on propaganda would be better used for conventional weapons. They doubted that paper could meaningfully affect hardened combat soldiers, but psychological warfare advocates pointed to intelligence from interrogated German prisoners, intercepts of German communications, and observed behavioral changes suggesting that leaflet campaigns were indeed affecting enemy morale. The production, creating the leaflets. Creating effective propaganda leaflets required sophisticated operations combining intelligence analysis, psychological expertise, artistic design, and industrial-scale production. The process revealed how much thought and resources the Allies invested in psychological warfare. Content creation began with intelligence analysis. Psychological warfare units studied German soldiers extensively, their backgrounds, beliefs, fears, and motivations. They analyzed intercepted German letters home, which revealed soldiers' private thoughts and concerns. They interrogated German prisoners, asking about morale, leadership problems, and what propaganda might be effective. They monitored German newspapers and propaganda to understand what Nazi authorities emphasized and what they tried to suppress. This intelligence informed leaflet content strategies. Different leaflets targeted different audiences: frontline infantry, rear echelon troops, Wehrmacht versus SS, older soldiers versus young conscripts, Germans from different regions. Each audience had distinct psychological vulnerabilities that leaflets exploited. Writers crafted messages in German that sounded natural and credible. Many were native German speakers, refugees who fled Nazism, prisoners of war who agreed to assist Allied psychological warfare, or intelligence officers who'd lived in Germany before the war. They understood not just German language, but German military culture, slang, and communication patterns that made leaflets seem authentic rather than obviously foreign propaganda. The tone was carefully calibrated. Early in the war, Allied leaflets sometimes lectured Germans about Nazi evil or predicted German defeat. messages that German soldiers dismissed as enemy propaganda. More sophisticated leaflets avoided obvious moralizing. Instead, they exploited specific anxieties through indirect messaging that felt less like propaganda and more like uncomfortable truths. Visual design was propaganda too. Some leaflets featured photographs, images of comfortable Allied prisoner of war camps, destroyed German equipment, or maps showing military situations. Others used illustrations or simple text. Color printing was occasionally used for maximum impact, though most leaflets were black and white due to production cost and speed considerations. Safe conduct passes were designed to look official and legitimate. They included text in multiple languages assuring humane treatment, Geneva Convention references, and sometimes signatures from Allied commanders. The design conveyed authority and seriousness, making German soldiers more likely to trust them as genuine promises rather than tricks. Size and format varied by purpose. Some leaflets were small, easily hidden by soldiers who wanted to keep them secretly. Others were large poster-sized sheets designed to be noticed and shared among multiple soldiers. Some were folded to protect content from weather during air delivery. Others were simple single sheets optimized for mass production. Production facilities operated continuously. British operations, centered at Psychological Warfare Division headquarters, used commercial printing equipment commandeered for war service. American operations in North Africa and Italy established field printing facilities near combat zones, allowing faster response to changing tactical situations. At peak production, these facilities printed millions of leaflets daily. Quality control was rigorous. Every leaflet was reviewed by native German speakers to catch linguistic errors that would undermine credibility. Psychological warfare experts assessed whether messages would resonate with target audiences. Intelligence officers verified factual claims to ensure leaflets contained accurate information that established credibility. Distribution planning required logistical coordination. Leaflets had to be packaged for aerial delivery, bundled with paper bands that would break apart at predetermined altitudes, scattering leaflets over wide areas. Packages were loaded into aircraft bomb bays or special leaflet dispensers. Pilots received target coordinates, altitude specifications, and timing instructions to ensure leaflets reached intended audiences. Some leaflets were delivered by artillery shell, specially designed propaganda shells that burst over enemy positions, releasing leaflets. Others were floated across front lines by balloon or carried by infiltrating agents who distributed them in occupied territories. The Allies used every available distribution method to maximize leaflet reach.
The messages. What the leaflet said. Allied leaflet propaganda evolved throughout World War II, becoming more sophisticated as psychological warfare experts learned what worked and what didn't. Understanding the specific messages reveals both psychological warfare techniques and the vulnerabilities the Allies exploited. Early leaflets focused on moral arguments against Nazism, denouncing Hitler's evil, describing Nazi atrocities, appealing to Germans' conscience. These proved largely ineffective. German soldiers fighting for survival weren't swayed by enemy moral lectures. They dismissed such leaflets as obvious propaganda not worth reading. More effective were leaflets exploiting practical concerns. Messages about how to surrender safely addressed German soldiers' fears about becoming prisoners. The leaflets explained surrender procedures, promised humane treatment under Geneva Convention, and sometimes included testimonials from German prisoners of war describing good conditions in Allied camps. The famous Safe Conduct Pass leaflets were among the most successful. These appeared to be official documents, printed on higher quality paper, with formal language and official-looking seals. They guaranteed, "The German soldier who carries this leaflet wishes to surrender.
He is to be disarmed but otherwise treated humanely, given food, shelter, and medical care. Multiple Allied commanders signed these passes, lending them authority. Interrogations of German prisoners revealed that many carried safe conduct passes for weeks before actually surrendering, keeping them hidden as psychological insurance, a ticket out of the war they could use when circumstances became desperate enough. Even soldiers who didn't immediately surrender felt reassured knowing they possessed an escape option. Tactical leaflets exploited specific military situations. Before major Allied offensives, leaflets would warn German units that attack was imminent, that resistance was futile, that surrender before the offensive began would save their lives. These created pre-battle anxiety and occasionally prompted desertions before fighting even started. After German defeats, leaflets emphasized the hopelessness of continued resistance. They'd reference specific battles where German forces were destroyed, name units that had surrendered, and describe how surviving prisoners were now safe while soldiers who continued fighting faced certain death. This exploited survivors' guilt and fear, suggesting that soldiers who kept fighting were foolish rather than brave. Home front propaganda targeted German soldiers' concern for families. Leaflets discussed Allied bombing of German cities, suggesting that German soldiers were dying in foreign lands while their families suffered at home. They implied that Germany's war effort was futile, that soldiers' sacrifices served no purpose, and that surrendering would allow them to eventually return home rather than dying pointlessly. Wedge propaganda attempted to create divisions within German military. Leaflets contrasted ordinary German soldiers with Nazi Party elites, suggesting that Wehrmacht soldiers fought and died while Nazi officials lived comfortably. They emphasized that Hitler and senior Nazis would escape consequences while ordinary Germans paid the price for their leaders' decisions. Regional propaganda targeted soldiers from specific regions in Germany, Bavarians, Rhinelanders, Prussians, exploiting regional identities and suggesting that Berlin-dominated Nazi leadership didn't care about non-Prussian Germans. This was sophisticated psychological warfare attempting to fragment German national identity. Medical propaganda addressed German soldiers' fears about wounds and illness. Leaflets discussed superior Allied medical care available to prisoners of war, contrasting it with deteriorating German medical services. They described specific treatments, antibiotics, surgical capabilities, hospital conditions that Allied POW camps provided. For wounded soldiers or those fearing injury, these messages offered powerful incentives to surrender. Seasonal propaganda exploited weather and holidays. Winter leaflets emphasized cold, hunger, and harsh conditions German soldiers endured, contrasting this with warm, well-fed conditions in Allied POW camps. Christmas leaflets were particularly poignant, discussing home, family, and questioning whether soldiers wanted to die far from loved ones during holidays. Sexual jealousy propaganda was controversial but used extensively. Leaflets suggested that foreign workers brought to Germany were having relationships with German women while soldiers fought abroad. These messages exploited soldiers' anxiety about maintaining relationships across years of separation. While morally questionable, interrogations revealed that such leaflets significantly affected morale. Truth propaganda was perhaps most effective. Rather than obvious lies, later leaflets focused on verifiable facts that contradicted Nazi propaganda. They'd report actual German casualty figures, document specific defeats, or reveal information Nazi authorities suppressed. German soldiers could verify these facts through their own experience, establishing leaflet credibility and making them trust other leaflet content. The delivery: how leaflets reached enemy. Delivering billions of leaflets to enemy soldiers required innovative logistics and sometimes dangerous missions. The methods evolved as psychological warfare units developed more effective distribution techniques. Aerial delivery was the primary distribution method. Special leaflet squadrons flew missions specifically to drop propaganda, while regular bombing missions sometimes carried leaflets alongside munitions. British and American air forces dedicated significant resources to leaflet operations, treating them as legitimate combat missions. Leaflet bombs were engineered for optimal distribution. Early versions were simple containers that burst at altitude, scattering leaflets. Later designs grew more sophisticated. Monroe bombs used adjustable fuses to control burst altitude, ensuring leaflets scattered over maximum area without being destroyed by wind or landing outside target zones. Some designs created paper clouds that drifted down slowly, maximizing ground coverage. Timing was critical. Night missions dropped leaflets so German soldiers would find them in the morning, discovering propaganda while starting their day's duties. Pre-dawn drops meant soldiers encountered leaflets during morning routines, reading them while eating breakfast or preparing for the day, moments when psychological defenses were lower than during active combat. Geographic targeting became increasingly precise. Psychological warfare units identified specific German divisions, located their positions through intelligence, and flew targeted leaflet missions over those particular units. Leaflets could be customized to reference specific situations those units faced, making propaganda more relevant and effective. Weather considerations affected operations. Wind patterns determined leaflet drift. Missions planned for conditions that would carry leaflets over intended targets rather than blowing them away. Rain destroyed paper leaflets, so missions were scheduled during dry weather. Winter snow complicated delivery, but also made leaflets more visible against white backgrounds. Artillery delivery provided alternative distribution. Special propaganda shells carried leaflets instead of explosives. When fired over enemy positions, these shells burst at predetermined altitude, releasing leaflets that fell into enemy trenches. This method allowed precise targeting of specific areas and could deliver leaflets during conditions preventing aircraft missions. Balloon delivery was used for long-range propaganda. Large balloons carrying thousands of leaflets were released with timing devices that burst balloons over enemy territory. Wind patterns carried balloons deep into German-held areas, delivering propaganda beyond aircraft range. This method was imprecise, but allowed reaching targets that conventional delivery couldn't access. Ground delivery by infiltrating agents was most dangerous, but most targeted. Special operations personnel would cross enemy lines carrying leaflets, distributing them in occupied towns, leaving them in places German soldiers frequented, or handing them directly to soldiers during brief interactions. These missions risked capture and execution, but delivered propaganda directly to intended audiences. Resistance networks distributed leaflets behind enemy lines. Anti-Nazi Germans, French resistance, Polish underground, and other partisan groups received leaflets through covert channels and distributed them in their areas. This grassroots distribution made leaflets seem more credible, appearing to come from fellow Germans opposing Nazism rather than obviously enemy propaganda. Sea delivery targeted coastal areas. Waterproof leaflet packages were released from aircraft or ships, drifting with currents to beaches in German-occupied territories. Beachcombers, fishermen, and coastal residents would find these packages and distribute contents, spreading propaganda through civilian populations, who then influenced soldiers on leave. Captured German prisoners sometimes participated in leaflet operations voluntarily. Anti-Nazi prisoners agreed to write leaflets or assist in distribution, lending credibility through authentic German voices. Some volunteered to cross back into German territory, delivering propaganda, risking death as traitors to help end the war they believed Germany should lose. The German response: suppression and counter-propaganda. Nazi Germany implemented extensive countermeasures, attempting to prevent soldiers from reading Allied leaflets and to neutralize propaganda effects on those who did read them. Understanding these countermeasures reveals how seriously German authorities took the leaflet threat. The Nazi regime made possessing Allied leaflets a criminal offense. Official orders declared that any German soldier found with enemy propaganda faced immediate court-martial and potential execution. German military police conducted surprise inspections, searching soldiers' belongings for contraband leaflets. Soldiers caught hiding propaganda could be shot on the spot as traitors. These draconian measures indicated that Nazi authorities feared leaflet propaganda significantly. If leaflets were truly ineffective, German commanders wouldn't need capital punishment to prevent soldiers from reading them. The severity of consequences for possession suggested that Nazi leadership recognized leaflets were undermining morale and wanted to stop this through intimidation. Collection and destruction operations attempted to remove leaflets before soldiers could read them. After Allied leaflet drops, German officers would order soldiers to collect and burn all propaganda materials immediately. Military police and Feldgendarme patrolled areas where leaflets fell, gathering and destroying them. Units received orders to report leaflet drops to headquarters so counter-propaganda responses could be coordinated. But these collection efforts were largely futile. With millions of leaflets falling across vast areas, collecting them all was impossible. Soldiers working alone had opportunities to read leaflets before officers arrived. Many soldiers deliberately hid leaflets, collecting them when officers weren't watching and keeping them secret, despite risks.
Counter-propaganda attempted to discredit Allied leaflets. German military newspapers and radio broadcasts warned that enemy propaganda was designed to weaken German fighting spirit. They claimed leaflets contained lies and exaggerations. They accused the Allies of psychological warfare meant to trick German soldiers into betraying their country. Some German counterpropaganda tried to inoculate soldiers against Allied messages by preemptively addressing concerns that leaflets exploited. German propaganda would acknowledge hardships soldiers faced, but frame them as necessary sacrifices for ultimate victory. They'd address concerns about families at home, about military leadership, about war progress, attempting to provide Nazi-approved answers before Allied leaflets planted doubts. Nazi authorities also created false leaflets designed to look like Allied propaganda, but actually containing Nazi messages. These fake Allied leaflets would mix real Allied propaganda elements with Nazi counter-propaganda, hoping to confuse soldiers about which leaflets were genuine. However, this tactic risked backfiring, creating more exposure to actual Allied propaganda as soldiers read all leaflets, trying to distinguish real from fake. Exemplary punishment was used as deterrence. When German soldiers were caught with Allied leaflets and executed, their units would be informed about the executions as warnings. Courts-martial for leaflet possession were publicized to create fear. Nazi authorities hoped that making examples of soldiers caught with propaganda would terrorize others into refusing to read leaflets. But punishment policies had unintended effects. The fact that Nazi authorities executed soldiers for merely possessing paper suggested the regime feared propaganda's power. This fear validated leaflet credibility. If Nazi leadership was so desperate to prevent soldiers from reading leaflets, perhaps the leaflets contained truths the regime wanted suppressed. The punishments themselves became propaganda, suggesting that leaflet content was dangerous to Nazi authority precisely because it was accurate. German military leadership grew increasingly frustrated with inability to suppress Allied leaflets. Internal documents complained that despite orders, soldiers continued finding and reading propaganda.
Some reports noted that certain units had declining morale that commanders attributed partly to leaflet exposure. But commanders had no effective solutions, short of hermetically sealing soldiers from outside contact. Preventing leaflet exposure was impossible. Some German officers took pragmatic approaches. Rather than simply forbidding leaflet reading, they would conduct group discussions where leaflets were read aloud and officers provided rebuttals to propaganda claims. This approach acknowledged that soldiers would encounter leaflets regardless of prohibitions and attempted to provide counter-arguments rather than relying on suppression alone. The impact. Did leaflets work? Assessing leaflet propaganda effectiveness is challenging, but multiple evidence sources suggest that Allied leaflets meaningfully impacted German military morale and contributed to eventual Allied victory. Prisoner of war interrogations provided the most direct evidence. Allied intelligence officers systematically questioned German prisoners of war about propaganda exposure and effects. Thousands of interrogation reports documented that German soldiers had read Allied leaflets and that many cited leaflets as influencing their decision to surrender. Specific statistics varied, but interrogation data consistently showed significant leaflet impact. Some studies found that 20 to 40% of German prisoners reported that Allied leaflets influenced their decision to surrender. Even accounting for prisoners overstating Allied propaganda influence to please captors, these numbers suggested substantial effects. German military documents confirmed that Nazi military leadership worried about leaflet propaganda. Internal Wehrmacht communications discussed declining morale attributed partly to Allied psychological warfare. German commanders requested additional counter-propaganda resources, suggesting they believed Allied leaflets were affecting their troops meaningfully. Behavioral evidence supported effectiveness claims. German military police reports documented increased efforts required to prevent soldiers from collecting Allied leaflets, suggesting that soldiers actively sought propaganda despite prohibitions. The frequency of courts-martial for leaflet possession indicated that many soldiers risked severe punishment to read Allied propaganda. Surrender rates correlated with intensive leaflet campaigns. During major Allied offensives where psychological warfare units conducted heavy leaflet drops before and during combat, German surrender rates were notably higher than in operations without coordinated propaganda efforts. While causation is difficult to prove definitively, the correlation suggested that leaflets contributed to reduced German fighting effectiveness. Unit-specific targeting demonstrated effectiveness. When Allies dropped customized leaflets over specific German divisions, referencing their situation and exploiting their particular vulnerabilities, those units subsequently showed measurably lower combat effectiveness and higher surrender rates. This targeted propaganda appeared more effective than generic messages. Long-term cumulative effects were significant. Individual leaflets might not immediately convince soldiers to surrender, but repeated exposure over months eroded morale gradually. German soldiers who read dozens of leaflets over extended periods showed greater susceptibility to propaganda than those with limited exposure. The cumulative psychological damage weakened fighting spirit even among soldiers who initially dismissed propaganda. Safe conduct passes proved particularly effective. Post-war surveys of German POWs revealed that many had carried Allied safe conduct passes for weeks or months before actually using them. The passes provided psychological reassurance and a rationalization for surrender. Soldiers could frame their decision as pragmatic survival rather than cowardice or disloyalty. The winter 1944-45 period showed dramatic leaflet impact. As German military situation deteriorated, with Soviet forces advancing from the east and Allied forces from the west, German soldiers became increasingly receptive to propaganda, suggesting that further resistance was futile. Leaflet campaigns during this period contributed to widespread German military collapse and mass surrenders. Regional variations existed. Western Front German soldiers appeared more influenced by Allied leaflets than Eastern Front soldiers, partly because Western Allied propaganda emphasized humane treatment, while Soviet propaganda was often more threatening. German soldiers feared Soviet captivity far more than British or American captivity, making Allied leaflets promising good POW treatment more persuasive on Western Front. SS troops proved more resistant to leaflet propaganda than Wehrmacht regulars. Heavily indoctrinated SS soldiers were less likely to read Allied leaflets or be influenced by them. But even SS units weren't completely immune. Interrogations documented that some SS soldiers did read and were affected by propaganda, though at lower rates than regular Wehrmacht. Quantifying exact leaflet impact remains impossible. Leaflets were one factor among many affecting German military effectiveness. Combat losses, supply problems, leadership failures, home front collapse all contributed to German defeat. But evidence consistently suggests that Allied leaflet propaganda meaningfully reduced German morale and fighting effectiveness, contributing measurably to Allied victory. The legacy: lessons from paper warfare. The World War II leaflet campaigns established principles and precedents that influence subsequent psychological warfare operations and continue shaping information warfare today. Understanding this legacy reveals both enduring lessons and evolving applications. The fundamental lesson was that psychological warfare can achieve strategic effects at relatively low cost. The Allies invested millions in leaflet operations, but achieved results that conventional warfare might have required vastly greater expenditure to accomplish. Every German soldier demoralized by propaganda and willing to surrender saved lives and resources on both sides. Credibility emerged as the most critical factor in propaganda effectiveness. Early Allied leaflets that made exaggerated claims or obvious lies were dismissed by German soldiers. Later leaflets that contained verifiable truths, accurate information, and realistic promises were far more effective. This principle, that propaganda must be credible to be effective, has guided psychological operations ever since. Audience understanding proved essential. The most effective leaflets exploited specific vulnerabilities of particular audiences. Generic propaganda had limited impact. Targeted messages addressing specific soldiers' concerns, fears, and situations worked far better. This principle drove increasingly sophisticated audience analysis in subsequent conflicts. Safe conduct passes became standard psychological warfare tools. Recognizing their success in World War II, military forces in subsequent conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, have consistently used safe conduct passes as surrender facilitation tools. The format and approach pioneered against Hitler's armies remain in use. Counter-propaganda lessons were also learned. Nazi Germany's failure to effectively counter Allied leaflets demonstrated that suppression through prohibition and punishment was counterproductive. More effective counter-propaganda requires addressing concerns that enemy propaganda exploits rather than simply forbidding exposure. The Korean War saw extensive leaflet operations directly influenced by World War II experience. United Nations forces dropped millions of leaflets over North Korean and Chinese positions using techniques developed against Germany. Many Korean War psychological warfare officers had worked on World War II leaflet campaigns. Vietnam War psychological warfare employed similar leaflet strategies, though with mixed results. Cultural differences, different motivations of enemy forces, and different tactical situations meant that techniques effective against Germans weren't always effective against Vietnamese communist forces. This highlighted that psychological warfare must adapt to specific enemy characteristics rather than applying universal approaches. Modern conflicts use electronic equivalents of leaflet operations. While physical leaflets are still sometimes employed, contemporary psychological operations increasingly use radio, television, internet, and social media to deliver propaganda messages. But the principles remain identical: exploit audience vulnerabilities, establish credibility, provide specific calls to action. Information warfare and cyber operations in contemporary conflicts descend directly from World War II leaflet campaigns. The concept of using information and messages as weapons, attempting to manipulate enemy perceptions and morale, originated in operations like Allied leaflet campaigns. Modern practitioners study World War II psychological warfare as foundational history of their profession. The ethical questions raised by leaflet propaganda continue being debated. Was it acceptable to manipulate German soldiers' emotions and fears? To exploit their concerns about families to encourage desertion? to spread technically truthful but misleading information? These questions about propaganda ethics remain relevant as modern militaries employ increasingly sophisticated psychological operations. Commercial marketing and political campaigning have adopted psychological warfare techniques pioneered in military leaflet operations. Audience analysis, message targeting, credibility establishment, emotional manipulation. All these principles developed for military propaganda now appear in advertising and political communication. The line between military psychological operations and civilian persuasion has blurred. World War II leaflet campaigns demonstrated that words can be weapons as powerful as physical force. The billions of leaflets dropped over Hitler's armies proved that psychological warfare could meaningfully affect military outcomes. This lesson that information operations are legitimate and effective tools of warfare has fundamentally shaped how modern militaries approach conflict. The Allied leaflet campaigns during World War II represent one of history's largest sustained propaganda operations. 6 billion pieces of paper carrying messages designed to break German soldiers' will to fight. Millions of aircraft sorties dedicated to psychological warfare. Thousands of intelligence officers, writers, translators, and designers working continuously to create propaganda that would save lives by convincing enemies to stop fighting. The leaflets were just paper. Fragile, easily destroyed, seemingly insignificant compared to tanks and bombers. Yet they carried power that artillery shells couldn't match. A leaflet couldn't kill, but it could convince a soldier to stop killing. It couldn't destroy a tank, but it could persuade a tank crew to abandon their vehicle and surrender. It couldn't capture territory, but it could make defending territory seem pointless. The German soldiers who picked up Allied leaflets faced impossible choices: continue fighting for a cause that seemed increasingly hopeless, or surrender and survive, but face accusations of cowardice and betrayal. Many chose to keep fighting despite doubts leaflets planted. Others surrendered, carrying safe conduct passes they'd hidden for weeks or months. Still others simply fought less effectively, their morale eroded by accumulated propaganda exposure. Nazi Germany's frantic efforts to suppress Allied leaflets, making possession a capital offense, conducting collection operations, executing soldiers caught with propaganda, revealed how much the regime feared these pieces of paper. The severity of countermeasures proved the effectiveness of the threat. Paper shouldn't have been dangerous enough to warrant execution, yet Nazi authorities recognized that Allied propaganda was indeed dangerous to their war effort. The leaflet campaigns saved lives. Every German soldier who surrendered because of propaganda rather than being killed in combat was a life saved. Every unit that fought less effectively because morale had been undermined by leaflets meant fewer Allied casualties in combat against them. The paper dropped from aircraft accomplished what bullets and bombs couldn't: changing minds, offering alternatives to fighting to the death, providing escapes from seemingly impossible situations. But the campaigns also raise uncomfortable questions about manipulation and psychological coercion. The Allies exploited German soldiers' fears, anxieties, and emotions to serve military objectives. They manipulated information, crafted messages designed to break morale, and used psychological vulnerabilities as weapons. Was this ethical warfare? Necessary warfare? Can we celebrate effectiveness while questioning methods? The answer perhaps lies in context and consequences. The Allies fought against genuinely evil regime committing genocide and threatening civilization. Psychological warfare that shortened the war and reduced casualties on both sides served moral purposes, even if methods involved manipulation. The leaflets offered German soldiers ways to stop fighting and survive, alternatives to pointless death. In that context, propaganda that saved lives seems ethically defensible, even if techniques were manipulative. The legacy endures in every modern conflict where psychological operations attempt to influence enemy morale. The leaflets that fell over Hitler's armies established precedents and principles that continue guiding information warfare. Every safe conduct pass distributed in recent conflicts, every propaganda message targeting enemy forces, every psychological operation attempting to reduce enemy will to fight traces lineage back to those billions of leaflets dropped during World War II. If this deep dive into how Allied leaflet propaganda undermined Hitler's armies captivated you, Please subscribe to Cipher Tales for more decoded mysteries from the hidden history of World War II. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. Like this video if you found it revealing and thought-provoking. Every like helps us reach more people who appreciate the complex, hidden dimensions of history. Comment below and tell us, were you surprised by the scale and sophistication of leaflet propaganda operations? Can you see connections between World War II psychological warfare and modern information operations? What other World War II propaganda and espionage intersections should we decode next? The Allies' use of rumor warfare, Japanese psychological operations, the role of forged documents in deception operations. Share this video with anyone fascinated by psychological warfare, military history, propaganda techniques, or the hidden stories of how wars are fought not just with weapons, but with words. Until then, remember, the most powerful weapons are sometimes those that change minds rather than destroy bodies. This has been Cipher Tales. Keep questioning, keep decoding, keep discovering the secrets that changed history.